Прежде всего, хотел бы поблагодарить президента Турции господина Реджепа Тайипа Эрдогана за то, что он принял приглашение и присутствует вместе с нами на 14-м международном авиакосмическом салоне МАКС-2019.
We got tensions between Moscow and Russia's largest ethnic group. We got the Kremlin playing footsie with a wayward NATO ally, and we've got fresh U.S. sanctions on Russia, and we got 2 prominent U.S. senators banned from Russia. It may be Labor Day weekend here in the U.S., and it may still be the August cucumber season in Russia, but we've got lots going on and lots to talk about, so stick with us. Hello from SIPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA, and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Don.
Hi, Brian.
Happy
nice
Labor Day weekend.
Happy to you.
It's just you and I this week, Don, and I figured since it was so much fun the last couple times we did it, I thought we'd look at several topics in rapid fire, what you used to call Moscow Miscellany in the embassy, if I remember correctly, rather than the usual deep dive into one subject. So if you're ready, here we go.
Let's go.
All right, let's go. Okay, the first thing on my mind is this nuclear accident that happened earlier this month in the White Sea, because this thing just keeps getting more and more disturbing. Roshydromet, Russia's National Weather Service, released a report this week saying that radioactive substances found in the atmosphere following the testing accident at Sverodvinsk in Arkhangelsk Oblast on August 8th indicate at the very least that there was a nuclear reactor at the site of the explosion, though the Kremlin continues to insist otherwise. Russian officials also turned off, we've learned this week, 4 nuclear monitoring stations in the area. Those are out there to monitor the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Don, you're an arms control expert. This is your wheelhorse again. What are your thoughts? How big a deal is this? And
well,
what does it
it's
tell us
funny
right
because
now?
I was on a foreign news broadcast last week insisting the interviewer was insisting it was comparable to Chernobyl. And it's not.
No, it's not
scale,
comparable to Chernobyl.
But that doesn't mean it's. And I kept saying that, and it was not
the
headlining.
scale is not Chernobyl,
exactly.
but the way
However,
the regime is reacting to this.
It is very serious. And I hate to say, my first reaction is it shows once again that to the Kremlin, life is cheap.
Yes.
And they take chances. My second point would be that it shows they are stretching to...
Seven people died in the explosion, and the doctors treating the injured were contaminated.
And I believe we're not told in advance.
We're not told in advance.
And this shows that they're stretching militarily to compensate for what they still see as a Western advantage, despite their recent successes in modernizing the armed forces. So they're pushing the limits. I think certainly pushing the limits too much. But the third point I would make is that the regime is reacting just like the Soviet regime in Chernobyl. Right. Secrecy, lying, prevarication, not having adequate nuclear safeguards. This is all the same as we've heard, not just the Chernobyl, but many other times. And that's very disappointing. Whoever's in charge is still not learning the lesson that political damage will be much less with openness, both at home and abroad.
And we still don't know what exactly happened there. The dominant theory out there is that they were testing this missile that was not nuclear tipped, but that was powered by a nuclear reactor. This is my understanding, although the story keeps changing. But this is what the dominant
the story jumps around. That's my understanding.
The story jumps around. That's my understanding at the moment. Now, this is something the United States tested back in the 50s.
Project Pluto?
I think so. And that about sums it up because it was so kooky and nutty that we even abandoned it back in those days.
And guess what? It doesn't work.
It doesn't work. But the other thing that jumps out, a couple things jump out at me about this. The other thing that jumps out about it, and you touched on it, they're stretched militarily in terms, and it senses that they sense that arms race is about to start up again. And they're scrambling to stay ahead of us and stretching themselves way, way too thin. That's the first thing that jumps out at me. The other thing about the regime's reaction is, and how similar it is to the reaction to Chernobyl, is it illustrates how brittle this regime actually is. It appears to be strong on the surface, and it is sturdy, but if it takes a blow, it doesn't know how to handle it. It doesn't know how to handle a crisis. and it clearly doesn't know how to handle this crisis because it's really gotten
because the comparison is not just to Chernobyl, as we've said the other week or two ago. It's to other avarie.
Kursk.
Under Kursk. The same kind of thing. We've had, 3 incidents last month alone. This is, again, it's not just this. It's a lot of things. Brittle is a good description of it.
I mean, we've always said this regime, and others have said this. James Scher has said it. Mark Eliade said it. I've said it, that this regime it's strong, but if it takes a blow, and I'm wondering if this could spiral into a larger crisis for the regime, given everything else that's going on right now. Do you see that?
Not this one thing.
Right.
But it undermines, and we had Ilya on recently, it undermines the confidence, such as it is, and diminishing in any case, the confidence of the average of the Narod for the regime. So it has both international and domestic consequences. Just one point, though, that these things take years to develop often, and the fact that they're stretching, we saw evidence of it, suggests maybe that this attempt has been going on for several years, no matter what the arms control regime might have been.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit more with you before we move into the next topic, since it is your kind of area. I mean, there is talk of a new arms race. The U.S. just recently tested an intermediate range missile. It publicized it.
And was blamed for violating the treaty, abrogating the treaty because they wanted this, which is not how things happen.
No, that's not how things happen. The capabilities, of course, were there, but this missile was not tested until the U.S. had withdrawn from the treaty. But what this signifies is we are moving into this arms race. What this accident in Arkhangelsk Oblast suggests that Russia is really stretching itself thin. Do you see this whole 80s scenario playing itself out again, where the U.S. is able to effectively spend the regime because for all the sanctions and all the troubles of the Russian economy and all the structural limitations of the Russian economy, we haven't had the arms race in the equation. And if you go back to the 80s, the Reagan years, I mean, one of the things that did happen at that time was the U.S. dramatically increased arms spending, and effectively Reagan said, "I'm going to spend you to death." Do you see that happening in this environment? Do you see us going there?
Excellent question. I would give a two-part answer, one of which is that both sides are modernizing their conventional and nuclear forces. Two, those modernization processes have been largely governed by arms control agreements, which are now appearing to be fall by the wayside.
We're about to enter a world with no arms control agreements.
Absolutely.
You have to go back before Nixon.
It makes the competition maybe more intense, more obvious. But the third point, very interesting. I would say that the response of the Kremlin to its inability to keep up financially, as technologically, with the West may well be an increased emphasis on other kinds of hybrid warfare.
Right.
That might be the response, not to give up, as Gorbachev apparently did in the late 80s. It's just hard to say. And an increase in hybrid war activity, what hybrid war is another program, can also be a risk-taking, and it can also become out of control. So I think at this point, you're not going to see them throw in the towel like Gorbachev did. You're going to see other forms of competition, which themselves are also dangerous.
I think that is correct, and I think you're also going to see them scrambling and cutting corners in an attempt to keep up, which is going to lead to very dangerous situations like this, which, not to put too fine a point on it, is a danger not just to Russia but to countries that happen to be in the neighborhood, which a lot of whom are our allies.
If you look at hard numbers, they still spend, I believe, a percentage less than we do on defense.
Yeah.
So we have a lot more of a cushion to work with, and they don't. And the cutting corners is exactly what I think is happening. Yeah. But they've always cut corners, but it's likely to increase, as you say, in this kind of a situation.
Right. Well, in this, I mean, and again, we don't know. This is all based on speculation, but this missile they were supposedly testing was supposedly designed to get around U.S. missile defense systems.
Yeah.
That was the whole idea of I mean, I don't understand the nuclear physics of it, and I won't pretend to, but that was supposedly the whole idea of this reactor-powered missile carrying a conventional warhead, which I still am having a tough time wrapping
I have no idea
my head around that.
whether you call that a nuclear missile or not.
Or not. That's a good question.
But remember, Putin hyped this last year.
Yes,
the cartoon.
he did. Yes,
excuse me, the drawing.
The cartoon. I liked your first choice of words.
Which again, as it shows a lot of bravado, but in push comes to shove, you get something like this happening,
Right.
and it likely, unfortunately, will happen again.
No, and we're likely to see more of these, and we'll continue to keep an eye on this. All right. Well, number 2 on my list is Tatarstan. I dealt with this this week on the Vertical video. This is something that caught my attention. The Russian State Duma is currently considering legislation that would make November 11th a national holiday, marking the Great Stand on the Ugra River, a 1480 standoff between Prince Ivan III of Moscow and Akhmat Khan. Russian historians consider this to be the event that marked the end of Tatar-Mongol rule in Muscovy. Supporters of the law say it will strengthen the patriotic consciousness of our citizens and popularize domestic history. The Tatars, not so much. Lawmakers in Tatarstan State Council have voted to urge the Duma not to pass the legislation, arguing that it contains elements of extremism that would promote interethnic discord, hatred, and prejudice. That was all for those of you that did not watch the Vertical video this weekend. Shame on you if you didn't. Now, I keep my eye on Tatarstan for a lot of reasons. Tatarstan's kind of close to my heart for a lot of reasons. I'd lived there in the early 90s. It was actually the very first place I lived in the former Soviet Union. It's where I studied Russian, ironically, Kazan State University.
I've always noticed your Tatar accent.
I would love to have a Tatar accent rather than my goofy American accent. This is one reason I keep an eye on the place. I find it very interesting. Other reasons are the Tatars are Russia's largest ethnic minority, and they, I think, have the strongest sense of ethnic and territorial cohesion. And in fact, Tatarstan is the one part of the Russian Federation that I think could be a viable state in the unlikely event that the Russian Federation ever dissolves. I'm saying that is likely, but if that unlikely event were to happen, I think Tatarstan is the one place I think that could form a cohesive state. The authorities in Kazan have carefully built up the attributes of statehood with representatives abroad and things like that. They won their battle to continue calling the head of the republic the president. So this controversy over the proposed holiday comes as Russian authorities are attempting to ban as extremist the prominent Tatar historian Vakhit Imanov's 1993 study of Muscovy's conquest and rule of the Tatars in the 16th and 17th century. So the period following this event that the Russians are trying to commemorate in their holiday. The book, which I believe is called The Secret History of the Tatars, it was popular among Tatars in the 90s, and it uses language like the Russian yoke, right? Turning the tide on the Mongol Tatar yoke, and refers to Russians as colonizers. Don, what are your thoughts on this? Does Moscow have a Tatarstan problem?
Well, actually, I've never been there, and I defer to your judgment on its autonomous possibilities for autonomy. But certainly if we talk about the loosening of Moscow's hold on some of the regions, which we have on this broadcast many times, certainly the Far East and Tatarstan are two candidates to take advantage of that, whatever that eventual legal status would be. All power to good luck
to them. I mean,
good luck to them, and you know
they are going to push it as far as they can. From my experience in the region, they are going to push it. My earliest memories in Kazan were big demonstrations in September 1991. I mean, literally not a week after the failed putsch broke up, there were Tatars on Freedom Square, Plosha Svoboda, in the center of Kazan, chanting Azad Lik, which means freedom in Tatar, calling for outright independence from Russia.
This shows you how hard it is to obliterate these kind of cultural themes and identities. And the Crimean Tatars, which are not the same, obviously, have been pretty much cleansed out of Crimea in many ways, and the Russians know there's a problem. But can I get to the issue of the battle itself?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Which is to say that every country has a usable history, which is often distorted or simplified or factually inaccurate. This is certainly one of those.
Right.
And that's why I loved your comment about the Imamov book. anybody who knows Russian history knows that the relationship between the Golden Horde and Muscovy was often cooperative. The influences went back
Muscovy
and forth.
rose to prominence by being the
being
collector,
yes.
the collector of the tributes for the Golden Horde.
At one point, I looked it up.
It was their original protection racket.
Yeah, about a fifth of the boyars were of Mongol descent.
Right.
I would argue, and I've asked the indulgence of my Russian friends for saying so, but I think some of the the attributes of political culture that we see in modern Russia are directly descended from extremism and other things we could talk about, from the inheritances of the Mongol political culture. So it's not black and white.
Right.
This was not a defense of Europe from the Asian masses. It was quite a bit different, and that's why I like the point of view that Imamov had in his book. There's the interaction is both ways,
yes.
And one man's yoke is another person's liberation. So
right.
You have to see. But again, I don't like things simplified that way. But Russia's not the only country that does it, of course.
Of course, when you politicize and manipulate history to the extent to which they do, it's going to be a double-edged sword.
Exactly. They're one of the worst at it.
And especially in a multi-ethnic polity.
Stalin, the whole business, the whole regime seems to rest on an invented history or distorted history that really is not what happened, and serious people know that that's not what happened.
But taking it from the granted that this is complicated and there's a lot of gray areas between Russians and Tatars, taking it from the point of view today, there are those who clearly identify themselves as Russians,
yes.
and those who identify themselves today as Tatars.
Yes.
And that this use of history this way is perilous in that environment.
Exactly.
When you add to that, and I'm kind of thinking out loud now, but if you think about Tatarstan in the context of the Russian Federation, it is kind of what Ukraine was in the Soviet Union. And this is the bit they if that goes, that's the end. And the Tatars have very skillfully, since 91, very smartly, pushed this as far as they could given the political circumstances. Under Yeltsin, they pushed it to the point of view where they practically had statehood. I mean, it was statehood within another state. They were a state within a state, effectively. And under Putin...
It's that boiling the frog thing. If you do it a little bit each time, you keep pushing out the boundaries, there's nothing provocative really for them to respond to.
But they do fight hard for some things like symbolic things, like calling their head of republic a president.
Yeah.
And calling their legislature the state council, right? That's actually, those things matter. Opening foreign representative offices abroad. They don't call them embassies. They call them foreign representative offices. They're careful. And inviting foreign governments to open up consular services in Kazan. So they're building up all these attributes. And I always thought, and I've talked to Tatar friends back at our old haunt at Radio Free Europe about this, are they just basically getting all the pieces in place just in case?
What was the answer?
And the answer was, a nod and a wink, a nod and a wink, and a probably yes. That they're getting all the pieces of statehood ready just in case, so they could flip a switch and have a state.
We talked about the Baltic republics last week, and in many ways it's a similar.
It is a similar dynamic.
Keep the autonomy, the sense of self. And they can't extinguish it, and ultimately it may prevail.
Well, no, this is why when I see a story on Tatarstan like this pop up in the Russian media, I tend to sit up and take notice to a greater extent than I do when you have protests on the streets of Moscow, because I think this is the kind of creeping thing, the soft underbelly of the power vertical in a lot of ways. So
I reread the history of the Great Stand, by the way, and I had forgotten some of the details. So it was very interesting, if misrepresented by the Russian side.
Right. Well, all right. Well, that's a good way to segue into the second half of our discussion. In a few moments, we will continue our discussion and shift from domestic politics to a few topics in foreign affairs. I'd like to remind you are listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SEPA.org. And you could follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Okay, so now we shift to foreign affairs, and the next thing on my list is Russia and Turkey. According to Russian officials, Moscow and Ankara are currently exploring the possibility of deliveries of the Russian-made Sukhoi Su-57 stealth fighter jet and the Su-35 aircraft to Turkey. Now, of course, Russia began delivering S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems to Turkey this year, causing tensions with the United States and the NATO allies, and causing Washington to cancel proposed sales of F-35 fighter jets to Turkey. Don, things appear to be escalating.
Yes, they certainly do. And I don't see any sign anytime soon of
Is
them
Turkey still in
de-escalating.
NATO? Can you answer that? I mean,
Yeah, it's like Tatarstan.
Call Brussels. Is Turkey still in NATO?
It's like Tatarstan. Yes, they are in NATO. I think we're not going to see or force their departure, but I think Washington has been relatively tolerant of this and giving them extra time to think about it.
Cutting them off on the F-35s.
No, but at some point they're going to have to draw the line. I think that's coming.
Look where this has gone. Turkey says, we want to buy S-400s. The U.S. says, you better not, or we're not going to sell you F-35s. We're not going to sell you F-35s. So
they bought them anyway.
Now we're going to buy Su-57s. I mean, this. Where does
we
this
have
go?
given them, I think, more time than they deserved, the Turks. But I think we're coming now to the end.
I think
of this.
there's wishful thinking that this is just an Erdogan problem and it's not a Turkey problem.
Yeah.
And that, I don't know, do people think Erdogan's going to be gone? I don't. I mean,
I
yeah,
don't
he
think
just
so.
lost
Despite
a couple
the
of
recent unpleasantness, no, I don't think so.
He just lost a
either.
couple of important mayoral elections in Ankara
I
and
don't think
Istanbul.
so either.
But
I don't think so
I
either.
don't think he's going anyplace anytime
To
soon. But maybe
maintain
this
our
is
credibility, though, we're
everything
gonna
will
have
get
to
back to normal after Erdogan.
Yeah,
is the feeling.
Our colleague Ben Hodges wrote about that recently. But I don't think we're coming to obviously a red line, forgive the expression, and we're going to have to respond.
Yeah.
Without kicking them out of
But
NATO.
how do you respond? I mean, if you look at the map, Turkey is an important ally in
No,
NATO.
respond is just in the more focused way that we're talking about here. That we're not going to kick them out of NATO. They still provide a useful, on paper at least, service to the alliance that can probably be restored at some point in the future. But in terms of practical cooperation, I think that's pretty much almost over.
No,
Wishful thinking notwithstanding.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about where the
Black
U.S.
Sea
and
is,
the
I
rest of
fear
the
to be
alliance.
interrupting. The Black Sea is now a central area, a region of competition, and Turkey's role is obviously central. So we're not going to kick them out of NATO, but there's a great deal of concern and interest and unease to some extent about what the Russians are doing in the Black Sea.
I mean, on one, it's very clear. I think you're right. The U.S. is going to have to draw a line. So it's clear what the U.S. is. It's very clear what the Russians are doing. Right? They're trying to troll NATO by drawing a very important NATO ally, drive a wedge between it and the alliance. What are the Turks doing? Why are the Turks doing this? I mean, really, if you look at it historically, there has never been an enduring Turkish-Russian alliance. The geopolitical interests conflict in too many places, in too many ways.
You're absolutely right.
What are the Turks doing?
This is partly, I think, driven by Erdogan's resentment at Europe, the growing Islamization of the country, which he has stimulated, and Turkey is just not abandoning its Western aspirations, for now at least.
Which is, a big part of the Turkish population still supports that.
Yeah, a big part.
I mean, I've heard theories, and this is speculation upon speculation, that when the Turks shot down the Russian fighter jet back in 2015, that the Turks were angry that NATO didn't back them up more forcefully.
Yes, but it's
vocally.
more than that too.
Yeah.
And it's more than that too, and a lot of it is driven by Erdogan. And this is like discussing Putinism without Putin.
Right.
Will this continue? Yes, probably at some more mild level it will. But again, the U.S. has come into this sort of late in the game and heavy-handedly, and it's more than just the weapon sales. It's about the strategic alignment of the country and the strategic importance of the Black Sea, which we are, again, waking up to rather slowly, I think.
Well, I want to pick up on
and by the way, that argues for keeping Turkey in NATO, at least on paper, and not being stronger.
Well, I'm going to
on
argue that it argues for something else as well. Because, yes, if you look at the map of the Black Sea and you're a NATO strategist, and if you look at it superficially, you think, oh, we're in good shape here. We got NATO member Turkey, NATO member Romania, NATO member
two aspirants,
NATO member Bulgaria, and 2 NATO partners, Georgia and Ukraine. It looks pretty good. But then if you look at the map a little bit deeper, and you have to start asking questions like, how reliable an ally is Turkey? Well, judging from what we've just been talking about for the past 5-10 minutes, not at all.
Yeah.
How reliable an ally is Bulgaria? Yeah. It's a little shaky. They're not doing the stuff Turkey's doing, but they're not not exactly Estonia either. Now,
this would argue for a more robust support of Ukraine.
Exactly, Don. You anticipated. I mean, not just Ukraine and Georgia.
Our friends in both places.
This is an opportunity. I would argue, and I hope you're listening in Tbilisi and in Kyiv.
I hope so. We know they are.
For friends of Ukraine and Georgia here in Washington and in Brussels and in other Western capitals, this is an opportunity for Georgia and Ukraine.
There's very
Turkey
little
going wayward says we need allies and anchors in the strategically vital Black Sea region. And this is a huge opportunity for Georgia and Ukraine to say, hey, we're happy to be those anchors.
Right. And they're not going to play the kind of games we see coming out of Ankara.
Yeah, and they're not going to play those kind of games. And this is an opportunity for Georgia and Ukraine to say, we can be providers of security, not just consumers of security. And so this is a way to remarket the NATO aspirations of these two partner countries. And I
hope they're paying attention here in Washington.
I certainly hope they're paying attention. And again, if you're listening in Tbilisi and Kyiv, take note, because I think this is I wish this weren't going on with Turkey. But with it going on, I think this is a golden opportunity for Georgia and Ukraine to say we are happy to be your anchors in the Black Sea, NATO. So let's move on from there. All right. Well, now we got a couple more things to talk about. The United States imposed new sanctions on Russia this week over Moscow's alleged I don't even want to put the alleged attempt to assassinate Sergei Skripal in Salisbury. Hell with this objectivity balance stuff.
Don't you hate that?
Right? The sanctions block international financial institutions. These are pretty tough sanctions, actually, when you look at the fine print of these things. The sanctions block international financial institutions.
Tougher stuff they should have done earlier, yes.
Yeah, well, it's been step by step, but it blocks international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF from lending or providing any technical assistance to Russia. It blocks U.S. banks from lending to Russia except for purchasing food or other agricultural products. And they authorized the U.S. Commerce Department to deny Russian export license for chemical and biological goods and technology. Now, these sanctions came into effect as a result of the Skripal assassination attempt, and it gave Russia a certain timeline with which to show progress in terms of coming to terms with this and investigating it and making sure it never happens again. Of course, Moscow did not meet any of those benchmarks. Surprise, surprise. And in came these sanctions. Now, following that, also this week, Moscow denied visas to 2 U.S. senators, Wisconsin Republican Ron Johnson and Connecticut Democrat Chris Murphy, the senator from my wonderful home state of Connecticut, which I will be visiting this weekend. The state, not the senator, who both were slated to visit Moscow as part of a bipartisan congressional delegation. Don, I'm not sure if this was a tit for tat, but it certainly looks that way.
Certainly looks that way.
It
is tit for tat. I think we're sort of in a dream world. I think I want sanctions. I want them to be tough, and I want them to be effective. But we are getting to the point of sort of rote imposition of sanctions in the absence of maybe more robust response to what Russia is doing. Do the senators really care? I don't think they do. This shows the asymmetry of Russia's capabilities. They can't do anything more than ban visas.
Right. And it's interesting they singled out Johnson and Murphy, both of whom are very outspoken on this issue.
The senators will survive their inability to go to Russia.
I think
Russia has no real weapons to act otherwise. And so I'm sure their staffers a few blocks from here are going like, whatever.
Do you remember the late Senator John McCain's immortal response when he was sanctioned and banned from Russia? I guess I'll have to cancel that vacation I was planning in Magnitogorsk.
Well, he died a year ago this week, so I'm glad you mentioned
it
him.
was, I did that on purpose, but I'll never forget that response because I thought it was brilliant. I wanted to use it and steal it sometime if I
So now you did, and good for you. I think...
go ahead.
I've been on the media a lot the last couple of weeks. I know you have too, and I guess I'm tired of explaining to foreign European friends in particular the complexities of U.S. policy to Russia. I mean, there is the Congress and parts of the administration are very tough, others less so.
Right.
And we very much need a more coherent, clear Russia policy. Because
I think we need more than a policy. I think I agree with you that we need to move beyond sanctions.
Yeah.
We need a doctrine.
A doctrine.
We need a doctrine. This is, this won't be the first time I've said this, and it certainly won't be the last. But what we're facing with Russia is a systemic conflict. It's a systemic struggle between two normative systems, and we need a doctrine in place. I mean, I have a doctrine called hybrid containment that I've been pushing and talking about for the last year.
The policy toward Russia, to Ukraine and Russia separately, again and again, and it's the same thing. Watch what we do and not what we say.
Mm-hmm.
Don't pay attention to what Trump says, but they've been good on NATO and Europe, all of which are true, but it's very, very confusing, not only for our friends, but for our adversaries.
Yeah.
And we need somebody to pull it back together in a more coherent way.
Yeah, and that starts with the interagency process.
Yes,
that
yes.
starts with
but in any
working
case,
closely with the
tough
allies.
sanctions, I support them here.
No, I looked at these sanctions. I was like, yeah, these are steps in the right direction. I'd like to see them go further.
Yeah.
I mean, I get kind of radical on this. I want to see things like export bans. I want to see things like banning the buying and selling of Russian sovereign debt, and I want to see us at least talking about a SWIFT ban. Knowing that it is a nuclear weapon, and we have to be very careful about deploying it.
In Europe in particular, as we saw a little bit at the G7 last week, there's still this residual romanticism about Russia being a constructive contributor to European security, and it's simply not going to happen.
Yeah, no,
under
I think
this regime, and most likely not under the next one.
I don't.
And so this romanticism has to go.
Well, we do our best to push back on it on this program, and
yes,
and
we do,
elsewhere,
and we'll continue.
And we will
I hope.
continue to do so. But I think again, we just have to keep stressing this conflict is systemic.
Yeah.
It's between one based on the rule of law and accountability, and one based on patron-client networks and corruption. And there is no middle ground. There is nothing we can compromise. This conflict isn't the result of a lack of dialogue or a misunderstanding. It's about
cooperation
two
on
incompatible
areas
systems.
of mutual concern. Well, of course. But that says nothing.
And what the doctrine that we should be putting in place is to basically protect our system. Again, it's about containment. And I think these sanctions are a step in the right direction, because part of this is I want to get us to a point where we stop letting the Russians have it both ways and to reap all the
it's never
benefits
clear
of the
to me
international
whether
system.
our response is laziness, confidence, whatever, but it's just infuriating sometimes.
It's what I think is that we just have not gotten over the post-Cold War paradigm of globalization, that basically it's going to be liberal values that spread with globalization, and now we're beginning to realize that hostile powers can use globalization to harm us.
And that horrible phrase, the right side of history.
Right. But I think this, again, step in the right direction. I think you're right. The senators will survive and
They'll go to some other
prosper. So all right. Well, on that note, since it's Labor Day weekend, we'll wrap it up early this week, since we all got things to do this weekend. I'm going to get on the Acela Express and go up and visit my home state of Connecticut. So on that note, we'll wrap it up. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you have been listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. And joining me in the studio has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA, and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks, Don, for
My pleasure as always, Brian.
very fun and enlightening discussion. I'd also like to thank our producer, Mikhail Harmata, for keeping the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled and in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org this week, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Just a little program reminder, we have a special 4-part series coming out over the next 2 weeks on the Russian world, or the Ruski Mir, so keep an eye out for that on the Vertical video. Join us again next week, and now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.